1914, when the first shots were fired, Europe led the way in everything. In 1945, when the guns fell silent, the world was bankrupt and exhausted. Across 3 decades in which empires crumbled, new players with new ideologies emerged. A world centuries in the making had been dismantled by a world war. On May 5th, 1936, Marshal Badoglio led his troops into Addis Ababa. On the 9th, Mussolini announced that he had annexed Ethiopia, and the diminutive King Victor Emmanuel was now its emperor. On the 12th, Pope Pius XI welcomed a new European and world peace. But there was no peace in China, in India, or in Ethiopia. Violence was the rule in Russia and would soon erupt in Spain. And for those bent on continuing the war that had started in 1914, peace was the last thing on their minds. Following Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, the League of Nations imposed sanctions on Italy.
So there is, for example, a ban on the sale of weapons to Italy, but also crucially to Ethiopia. Also a ban on the importing of certain Italian goods, a ban of exporting of certain goods to Italy, but really crucially, the export to Italy of certain key materials such as oil, coal and steel were not included in these sanctions, these embargoes. So ultimately, these sanctions are very limited efficacy and are only in force for a very short amount of time. What's also really clear is that while there was condemnation of Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, that countries were not willing to do very much more.
The military historian, Basil Liddell Hart, thought Britain's failure to stare down Mussolini in 1935 the most fateful turning point in the period between the wars. And this, combined with Japan's invasion of Manchuria, revealed the League of Nations' weakness.
Initially, the British and the French and all the rest, they look at Japan and China and they see Japan, a modern nation state, and China, they think, oh, this is just a disorganized, ununified state. But over time, as the expansion continues and continues, and then when Manchukuo was created, the Chinese keep bringing back the issue.
But who would respond to China? Not the King of England. In January, the figurehead of the British Empire, King George V, died. He was to be succeeded by his son, the popular Prince of Wales, who would reign as Edward VIII.
God save the King!
But not for long. His affair with an American divorcee was not a problem, but he would insist on marrying her, resulting in his shocking abdication.
His former Majesty, King Edward VIII, did declare his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for himself and his descendants.
With the British people distracted and lacking a strong sovereign, even their body politic seemed removed from the real dangers swirling around them. Germany's rearmament, the Spanish Civil War, and Italy's invasion of Ethiopia.
Deutschland hat abgerüstet.
On Saturday, March 7th, Hitler rose to address the Reichstag in a special session. Millions were listening on the radio. They heard, "The German Reich government has today re-established the full and unrestricted sovereignty of the Reich in the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland." The Rhineland, a strip of territory on the eastern bank of the river, constituted an important part of France's defensibility.
It's important to remember here, the Rhineland was indisputably part of Germany, so you wouldn't say he invaded the Rhineland. But under the Treaty of Versailles, the rule was that Germany couldn't station troops in this region because it bordered right on France and Belgium, and so this was for French and Belgian security. But in the spring of 1936, Hitler decided to break this rule to sort of symbolize defiance of the treaty.
When Hitler sent his troops into the Rhineland, his officers carried sealed orders instructing them to withdraw at once if challenged. They were not.
Hitler gambled that the British and the French would not fight to uphold the treaty, and he turned out to be right.
The Council of the League condemned the German action, and the Soviet foreign minister suggested sanctions, but no one supported him.
Hitler's intention with moving into the Rhineland was really to test out the Western response, and when the West didn't respond, really, he concluded that that was a kind of green light for him to keep going in the direction he was going.
3 weeks after Hitler sent his troops into the Rhineland, Anthony Eden rose in the House of Commons and told its honourable members, "It is the appeasement of Europe as a whole that we have constantly before us." British foreign policy had staked its claim to peace in Europe at all costs. Europe was in crisis. In times of crisis, the world looked to experienced leaders, and in the US, the nation turned to FDR. President Roosevelt accepted the nomination of the Democratic Party for a second term.
My friends, neither individually nor as a party can we postpone and run from that fight on the advice of defeatist warriors.
He famously said, "To some generations much is given. Of other generations much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny." And so did FDR. But across the pond in France and in Spain, there was a political paradox unfolding. Depression and hunger saw power move from right-wing parties into the hands of the left. France's general election of May 1936 saw left-wing factions unite to produce a victory for the French Popular Front. But the left seldom remained united, and seldom for long.
So there's been a real shift to the left in French politics as a result of left-wing fear of the extreme right and as a result of the Depression. Léon Blum is elected in May 1936. He becomes the first ever socialist prime minister, Popular Front.
Léon Blum's June election ushered in a summer of high spirits and helter-skelter social and industrial reform. Then the bills fell due, the economy stuttered, the franc dropped, and Blum was gone after 382 days. and in neighboring Spain, political upheavals in this decade would chart their course for several more decades. In Spain, the election in February had lifted the left-leaning Popular Front into power.
A liberal, Republican and socialist coalition, essentially, carries out limited reforms to the church, provokes a huge reaction from conservative groups that up to that point have been in some disarray, unites them in support of the church.
The fascist Falange party secured 0.4% of the vote. But in name, at least, it was shortly to become Spain's governing party.
The Falangists are the Spanish fascist-leaning party, quite small up until the time of the Civil War when it expands rapidly, but they do believe in the use of violence and overthrowing the government.
And this led to the end of the Second Republic in Spain.
The unwillingness of the right to compromise is notorious in Europe at that time. The Spanish political elite on the right are seen as amongst the most reactionary in Europe. But on the other hand, they're also looking at what's happening in other European countries, and particularly Nazi Germany and Austria, where there are right-wing movements too.
On the morning of July 18th, 1936, an announcement on Spanish radio claimed, "All over Spain, the sky is cloudless." Many would have dismissed the news as a weather report, but it was actually a coded message. It signaled for Francisco Franco's troops in the North African city of Ceuta to begin their invasion of Spain. Franco and the generals commanded enough troops to transform their coup into a civil war.
You need Franco's forces, and they're based in Morocco. So that's what makes Franco the key leader, and he proves that through the summer of 1936.
Within a month of the rising, General Francisco Franco had the support of Italy and Germany, who were affecting political outcomes in Spain through men and machines.
So really what fascist Italy wanted to do was to secure Spanish support for Italy's designs on the rest of the Mediterranean space. And it was really this that was the motivating force behind Mussolini's support of Franco in the Spanish Civil War.
Blood was pumping across the landscape. Perceived enemies, traitors or turncoats were being gunned down, and women were being raped.
When they capture those towns, they often carry out terrible atrocities. So the famous case is Badajoz. The Franquist forces of the Foreign Legion drive a lot of the men folk from the town into the bull ring of the city and execute huge numbers of people, in the thousands.
In March 1937, at the Battle of Guadalajara, Republican forces sent Italian formations into headlong retreat. But weeks later, German bombers destroyed Guernica,
which is later made famous by Picasso's masterpiece of the same name. They systematically bomb the town. which causes enormous shock around Europe and around the world because it's seen as the first bombing of a European undefended open town and attack on civilians.
The Spanish Civil War was a bloody physical battle, but it was also an ideological battle.
You have new ideologies that really want to establish a new world order, two competing ideologies. You have communism on one side, and on the other side you have fascism, Nazism. And these two competing ideologies are just not compatible.
When the Nazis clearly were behind the nationalists, and the Italian fascists were behind Franco, the Soviets supported the Republicans because it became a proxy war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany.
But Soviet support for the Republican side hardly matched the massive support Franco received from Hitler and Mussolini.
The key factors in explaining Franco's victory in the Civil War are fundamentally diplomatic because of British non-intervention and because of German and Italian intervention. Franco would never have won the Civil War. It's absolutely central, the issue of supplies and support.
The Bolsheviks may have been trying to influence events in Spain, but they also had plans for their own people. In April of 1937, the Central Committee of the Communist Party launched the Great Terror, a campaign to solidify Stalin's power over his party and remove any lingering political rivals.
So the motivation behind the terror is to deal with domestic opposition before the war begins. War will necessarily unsettle and weaken a regime. It demands total unity, and the regime wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be anybody who spoke out against the leadership or who acted in the interests of the enemy.
The Great Terror continued for 2 years, and the death toll in 1938 stood around 700,000 people. This was the price for Stalin's political stability. On July 7th, shots were fired at the Lugu Bridge outside Beijing, known to Westerners as the Marco Polo Bridge. It was a piece of theater contrived to justify Japan's full-scale invasion of China.
Cities like Beijing and Tianjin fell to the Japanese in July 1937, so only a few weeks after the Marco Polo incident. Northern China was more or less under the control of the Japanese by 1938.
As Japan intensified its assault on the city, the wife of Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek issued an impassioned plea.
You have seen in the pictures, and you have read of the destruction of homes and the terrible slaughters being carried out by the Japanese throughout our country, wherever their bombers could fly.
The strategies of the Kuomintang was to retreat into the interior and leave the Japanese to pursue them. And that strategy is called trading land for time. And to accentuate those difficulties, they adopted a scorched earth policy.
At the end of the year, lantern parades through the streets of Tokyo celebrated the fall of Nanjing. What followed the city's fall cost Japan any international support it had. A famously disciplined army ran amok.
So by the time they get to Nanjing, everything is already broken down. Complete breakdown in discipline. The high command has gotten way back behind most of these soldiers.
Japan's view on race actually affected their conduct during the war. December 1937, when the Nanjing massacre occurred, but race was definitely the contributing factor in terms of the dehumanization, the denigration of the Chinese people.
The International Military Tribunal of the Far East later estimated that more than 260,000 non-combatants had been killed. Back in Spain, Francisco Franco established his first cabinet in Burgos.
Franco is the dominant leader because of his reputation on the battlefield, because of his cult of personality, because of his connections with the political elite, because of his command of the Foreign Legion, and because of his performance in the first months of the Spanish Civil War.
And Europe continued hurtling headfirst into war, with another dominant leader eyeing his neighbors. Hitler had designs on reuniting Germany with his homeland. The Anschluss, or political union of Germany and Austria, was enabled by Hitler's annexation of the country, and it was wildly popular in both Germany and in Austria. Here was continuity, a greater German empire, all Germans united under a single flag.
It's quite clear that Hitler's got his eye on Austria, the idea of the so-called Anschluss, bringing Austria and absorbing Austria into Germany. So Hitler is clearly expansionist.
On March 12, 1938, troops crossed the Austrian border. There was no battle. On March 15th, in Vienna's Heldenplatz, Hitler proclaimed to a wildly enthusiastic crowd the entry of my homeland into the German Reich. And the world watched as Hitler pushed deeper into Western Europe from afar. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain told the Commons that British rearmament was having a sobering effect, a steadying effect on the opinion of the world. The question is whether the Prime Minister was deluding or delusional. In Europe, Hitler turned his, and therefore Europe's, attention to another German population detached from the fatherland, the Sudeten Germans of Czechoslovakia.
In the ideological sense, the whole idea of National Socialism and of Hitler, the idea of pan-Germanism, of uniting all Germans into one common state, one united state, to make sure that all Germans in Europe, wherever they live, can live in one state, is one of the core elements of Nazi ideology.
At a May 28th meeting with military and civilian leaders, the Führer announced, "It is my unshakable will that Czechoslovakia shall disappear from the map."
Hitler's ultimate aim was always to start another war. And from that perspective, Czechoslovakia was in a position where he had to, first of all, cripple it as a political unit, as a kind of possible military unit against the German war effort. Also because of the geographic location being right between Austria and Germany and complicating any future war effort on the side of Germany.
The British plan of appeasement clearly wasn't working. Chamberlain finally had to act, so he travelled to Hitler's private mountain retreat, Berchtesgaden, for their first meeting.
My policy has always been to try to ensure peace, and the Führer's ready acceptance of my suggestion encourages me to hope that my visit to him will not be without result.
Neville Chamberlain did something which politicians basically never did in that time. He got on a plane and he flew to see Hitler. This seems normal to us now, but this was really dramatic and kind of shocking to the world in 1938.
Ich bin vom Himmel gefallen, said Hitler, when he received the message in which Chamberlain offered to meet him. A simple translation might be, "You could knock me down with a feather." But Hitler made no effort to shorten Chamberlain's flight, 7 hours. Or the train journey that followed it, 3 hours. Nor did he meet him at the station.
Chamberlain, on the one hand, didn't think much of Hitler. He thought he was sort of crude and rude and in some ways unimpressive. But also, like a lot of politicians, Chamberlain had a lot of vanity and self-importance, and he was sort of pleased with himself that he felt he had made a strong impression on Hitler.
When they finally met, Hitler told Chamberlain what he wanted, and Chamberlain went home.
I've come back again, rather quicker than I expected. And I feel satisfied now that each of us fully understands what is in the mind of the other.
He then persuaded the French to abandon their little Entente ally and told Czechoslovakia, now friendless, to accommodate Herr Hitler.
Famously, he wrote to one of his sisters, "I felt when talking to him that here was a man who would keep his word when he had given it." This is another of those sort of fatal, famous last words things. Of course, it did not turn out to be true, but it was important that Chamberlain believed it.
I trust that all concerned will continue their efforts to solve the Czechoslovak problem peacefully, because on that turns the peace of Europe in our time.
At 5 p.m. on September 21st, the Czech government surrendered to the Anglo-French demand that they cede between 4,000 and 6,000 square kilometers, and it's more than 1.5 million Sudeten Germans to the Third Reich.
In this way, this was part of the whole program of ensuring that all Germans can live in one state.
Later that evening, with Hitler's connivance, Polish and Hungarian ministers presented their own territorial demands to Prague. It took generations for a British government to offer home rule to the Irish, and they were still resisting the call of a few 100 million Indians. But incredulously, they conceded the Sudeten Germans' right to self-determination in little more than a heartbeat. Hitler was not satisfied. Hitler wanted something more. Hitler wanted to send his troops into Czechoslovakia.
If they wanted to start another war, Czechoslovakia had an alliance with Russia. So obviously, once Hitler's aim was always to go to the east, to expand Germany to the east. then to get rid of the Czech state was obviously on his agenda. Was also for the future creation of the living space for the German people, which Hitler imagined in the Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, where the Germans were to dominate this territory.
But Chamberlain still wanted to appease. He took his second flight in an aeroplane for a second meeting at Bad Godesberg, where Hitler dismissed what had been agreed in favor for a further stride along the path to annexation. Chamberlain flew home, where Cadogan, permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, said, "I was completely horrified." He was quite calmly for total surrender. Chamberlain lost the support of his cabinet. The French cabinet and the British opposition, led by Clement Attlee, favoured a strong response to Hitler's bullying. Incredulously, Chamberlain proposed a third mission to Berlin. On the afternoon of the 26th, Chamberlain's emissary to Berlin, Sir Horace Wilson, presented the Prime Minister's proposals for an international conference. He was met by a rant in reply. Hitler insisted his demands be met. That evening, Hitler spoke at the Sportspalast. His speech, broadcast live, lasted for an hour. "If this problem is solved," Hitler told his audience, "there will be no further territorial problems in Europe for Germany." That following day, Neville Chamberlain broadcast the speech that has been used ever since to damn appeasement. He told listeners that people were writing to him from all over the country.
How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing.
I think the question of Chamberlain's motivations are really important because, unfortunately, the poor man has gone down in history as a symbol of weakness and cowardness and foolishness. And actually, Chamberlain was none of those things. Chamberlain, like almost all Europeans in the 1930s, had an absolute horror of another war coming, and he thought really anything was preferable to that.
On September 27th, the US State Department, believing that Hitler would march into Czechoslovakia the next day, appealed to Mussolini to arrange negotiations.
Benito Mussolini was one of Hitler's most important inspirations. Fascist Italy provides certain models for Germany in terms of political theater, in terms of the cult of leadership and personality around Mussolini that would be replicated in some ways with Hitler.
Such appeals were irresistible to a man of Mussolini's ego. The Italian ambassador in Berlin was instructed to ask Hitler for a delay. Ambassador Attalico visited the Chancellery 4 times before gaining Hitler's agreement to a conference, so long as Mussolini attended. Munich was to be the venue. Hitler traveled to Kufstein to meet Mussolini, and the two leaders completed their journey in Hitler's special train.
Hitler was thinking of the bigger picture. Hitler wanted to isolate France, and that would require a closer relationship with Italy, which develops in 1936 and 1937.
Mussolini was given the German proposals, and at the Munich conference presented them as his own. Chamberlain received news of Hitler's agreement when a message was passed to him while he was on his feet in the House of Commons. He explained, "I have now been informed by Herr Hitler that he invites me to meet him at Munich tomorrow morning. He has also invited Signor Mussolini and Monsieur Daladier. Signor Mussolini has accepted, and I have no doubt Monsieur Daladier will also accept. I need not say what my answer will be."
I was a little boy. I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try, try, try again. That's what I'm doing.
They met at the Führerbau without an agenda, but posed for photos. There stand the men in suits with their waistcoats and watch chains. Here stand the men in uniforms with their medals and armbands. Unsurprisingly, what was agreed at Munich differed little from what had been demanded at Bad Godesberg. The Czech delegates, made to wait outside, were invited to sign. They consulted their government. Their military leaders wanted to fight. But Edvard Beneš, the Czech president, told them he was not prepared to lead the country into a slaughterhouse for some empty gesture.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
Peace for our time was the famous, notorious boast of the British Prime Minister about the Munich Agreement. Indeed, he would proclaim this mantra for some time to come. But peace was far from the agenda for Hitler. And his plan for world domination extended further than just a grab for territory.
By the fall of 1938, Hitler had become increasingly determined to push Jews out of Germany. In November 1938, the Nazi regime orchestrated a nationwide pogrom against its German citizens. And Germany had not seen anything like it since the Middle Ages. Hitler was closely involved in every stage of the pogrom.
Kind of rubble on German streets. All these Jewish shops are vandalized, so you have the glass display on the floor, and as the fire is reflecting in the glass, broken glass, it gives the kind of image of a crystal. So that's why the Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, our night of broken glass.
By the end of Kristallnacht, 267 synagogues were torched. 91 Jews were killed. Many more killed themselves. Others died of heart attacks, and later, unseen victims of unknown cruelty in Nazi custody.
About 7,000 Jewish shops are destroyed, vandalized. Countless apartments owned by Jews are destroyed.
Kristallnacht should not have been revelatory, but it was. And some in Westminster now saw that more than a power struggle was in play. This was a moral struggle. And Hitler pledged himself to the destruction of Jewish blood.
Mass killing was not part of the agenda at this point. The point was to make life intolerable for Germany's Jews. He had a racialist conception of humanity, like a lot of people, but he adopted an extreme version of it and considered Jews to be a race of people, and a race of people who presented a mortal danger to the German race.
This systematic terror and destruction of the Jews would continue for years to come. While Hitler consolidated power, Franco was doing the same in Spain. On the morning of January 22nd, Republican General Rojo told his prime minister that the front had ceased to exist. Negrin, in response, ordered all government departments to abandon Barcelona. 48 hours before the entrance of the enemy, wrote General Rojo, Barcelona was a dead city. On March 26th, the final nationalist advance began, and on March 31st, it was done.
At the end of March 1939, the Francoist troops basically roll into Madrid. It's not even defended. Some of the Francoist forces arrived at the metro stations in Madrid, so the underground system, and simply bought a ticket, got on the metro, and travelled into central Madrid that way. They didn't need to fight.
Neville Chamberlain visited Rome for 4 days of talks with Mussolini. He judged it a wonderful meeting. Mussolini took a different view. His visitors had been, he said, the tired sons of a long line of rich men, and they will lose their empire. To celebrate the 6th anniversary of his appointment as Chancellor, Hitler delivered a speech to the Reichstag that lasted for more than 2 hours. This was the speech in which he prophesied the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. The following day, President Roosevelt spoke to senators who were about to vote on a bill that would authorize the purchase of thousands of aircraft for the Army Air Corps. His topic was how to deal with Hitler, and he said, "There isn't any use calling him a nut because he is a power, and we have to recognize that." As if to prove the president right, in March, Hitler announced that German forces would move to occupy Prague and eliminate the Czech state in 5 days.
The long-term factors of going to war and getting to good strategical position to get to war, to get rid of country which was inimical against Germany, who was allied with Russia, with France, part of the France alliance in Eastern Europe. But then also the ideological, ethnic nationalist reasons for including this space into the German space.
The fearfully browbeaten Czech president ordered Czech troops not to resist the German invaders. Failure to do so, Goering told him, would mean bombs falling on his historic capital. When news of the annexation of Czechoslovakia reached London, Chamberlain rose in the Commons and said, "Do not let us, on that account, be deflected from our course," which he said was the hope of peace. He was not applauded. Chamberlain's repeated calls for peace were not having the stabilizing effects they had once had. On Good Friday, Mussolini, for no good reason except perhaps to try to match his fellow dictator, invaded Albania, already an Italian protectorate.
What Mussolini wanted to do was to recreate the ancient Roman control of the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean had been known during ancient Roman times as Mare Nostrum, our sea. And what Italy should do was to have sole control of the Mediterranean, and this was really the major foreign policy objective of fascist Italy.
Albanian King Zog's crown was passed to the diminutive Italian king, to whose titles Il Duce had already added Emperor of Abyssinia. It was now clear that the city of Danzig-Gdansk must be next on Hitler's shopping list. The League of Nations intervened, but, of course, Hitler was not going to be stopped. Momentum was building, and Hitler could envisage his glorious victories. Finally, on March 31st, Neville Chamberlain pledged Poland all support in Britain's power.
If an attempt were made to change the situation by force in such a way as to threaten Polish independence, why then that would inevitably start a general conflagration in which this country would be involved.
But Chamberlain's about-face came too late.
He took too much at faith, especially in his meetings with Hitler in September 1938. He took too much from Hitler's assurances. He was too confident that he had solved this problem, especially coming out of the Munich conference.
The American ambassador in Paris wrote to his president, "There is a curious serenity from one end of France to the other." It was, he thought, as if people had realized Hitler could be stopped by nothing but force.